From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
So, good afternoon. Welcome to the Library of Congress. I am Grant Harris. I'm head of the European Reading Room over in the Jefferson Building across the street. Together with the Embassy of Italy and the Italian Cultural Institute, we are delighted to welcome our special guest, distinguished Professor Salvatore Settis, who will discuss his timely and acclaimed book, If Venice Dies. Let me mention that the Library of Congress is proud of its 400,000 volumes from or about Italy. It includes an extensive collection of monographs on the subjects of Italians in the United States, for example. We acquire each year much of the best research level materials from or about Italy. And we are proud to have the works of Professor Settis in that collection. I counted well over 50 items in our collections where he's written maybe a foreword or edited or curated. So we're very pleased to have you here today. In talking about the collections, let me also mention the two people who within the library who have helped with this very much. Taru Spiegel, if you just raise your hand there in the European Division, and Lucia Wolf, who is our specialist for Italy. And if you have questions about using the collections, please get hold of Lucia Wolf now or later. The European Division is responsible for providing reference and for developing the library's collections relating to continental Europe, and Lucia does that for Italy and Malta and Italian materials from Switzerland, Vatican City, and San Marino. I think I've listed most of you. All right. Now, after the lecture, we will have a few minutes for questions and answers before the book signing. We hope you have a pleasant time here today and that you'll come back and use the collections. Please turn off your cell phones and recording devices for the duration of the program. Also, be aware that this event is being recorded for a later webcast. Renato Miracco, the cultural attaché at the Italian Embassy, cannot be with us today. He was instrumental in putting this together. Unfortunately, he has a family bereavement back in Italy, so we hold Renato and his family in our thoughts today. I welcome Michael Wise, co-founder of New Vessel Press and publisher of the English translation of If Venice Dies. New Vessel Press specializes in making foreign works available to English speakers. If Venice Dies has been ably translated by Andre Nafis Saheli. Michael Wise has been a foreign correspondent for Reuters and The Washington Post. He is the author of a book on German architecture, and his writing has appeared in many publications that I personally like. The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the New Yorker, the Atlantic, and Foreign Policy. That's quite a list. That's not all, though. So I would welcome Michael to speak to us now and introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're very grateful to the Library of Congress for arranging this program. I'm co-founder with Ross Effberg of New Vessel Press, and we're extremely pleased to be the publisher of the English translation of Salvatore Settis' book, which appeared 2 years ago in Italy as Se Venezia Muore, and now as If Venice Dies, translated by Andre Nafis Saheli. Salvatore Settis is an archaeologist, an art historian, and former director of both the Getty Research Institute of Los Angeles and the Scuola Normale Superiore of Pisa. He's currently the chairman of the Louvre Museum Scientific Council and can be considered the conscience of Italy for his role in spotlighting the country's neglect of its national cultural heritage. And I think you'll soon understand why that is when you hear him speak today about his concerns that he so cogently lays out in If Venice Dies. Washingtonians may remember that he delivered the Mellon Lectures at the National Gallery of Art in 2001, and he also gave the Isaiah Berlin Lectures at the Ashmolean at Oxford in 2000. His research interests are centered on ancient and Renaissance art history, and his many publications include The Future of the Classical, Artisti e Commenti fra quattro e cinquecento, and he was co-editor of the Classical Tradition. He has served as chair of Italy's High Council for Cultural Heritage and Landscape, and his most recent book, Costituzione, deals with the current debate about constitutional reform in Italy, in which Professor Settis has been extremely active ahead of a referendum to be held in Italy in early December. He finds time as well to curate exhibitions, including last year's opening pair of shows at the Fondazione Prada in both Milan and in Venice about classical sculpture. And he's also now working on an exciting new exhibition that will be held in Rome in 2018 of the collection from the Museo Torlonia, the largest private collection of classical and Greek Roman sculpture art in the world. A select sample of this impressive array will be shown atop the Campidoglio in Rome, and we would be very fortunate if it comes to the United States as well. Finally, I'd be remiss as his American publisher if I didn't urge you to buy a copy of his book, which is on sale outside. The book has received considerable acclaim, most recently a wonderful review in the Washington Post. And as you'll hear now, If Venice Dies is an eloquent appeal to save the soul of one of the world's greatest cities and a wake-up call for us all to heed what's happening to our own lives and what could happen to historic cities everywhere.
Thank you, Michael, for this generous introduction. I'm particularly glad to be here, and I thank you all for inviting me to give a talk here about my book and about Venice more generally. I'm very grateful to the Italian Embassy and to Renato Miracco particularly, and Angela Tergiano, who is here now, and to the Library of Congress, particularly to Lucia Wolf and Taro Spiegel for organizing this event. And I'm particularly grateful to Michael Weiss for translating my book in English. My lecture, as you will understand quite soon, is based on my book, but not identical with my book. By way of introduction, let me make two short remarks. First, while my books focus from the title on Venice, it is not only about Venice. It is about the destiny of historical cities around the world, in Italy, but not just in Italy. Second point, If Venice Dies, putting death in a title is not necessarily a good idea, but what I wanted to stress is that death is a good vantage point wherefrom we may look at trauma, at problems of life. So, as in private life, when we have a trauma from some death of a mother, father, of a person who is dear to us, this will bring us to think more about our life and in different terms. So, if Venice dies, this is not just to comply with the topos of death in Venice, but to reflect what will happen, what might happen if Venice dies. And just to start with, what you see on the screen is not Venice, but Las Vegas. Of course, you may recognize that the proximity of different buildings to the Rialto Bridge, which is much nicer than this one, and the Doge's Palace. Okay, cities die in three ways. When a relentless enemy destroys them, like the Romans did with Carthage in 146 BC, when a foreign nation installs itself with force, driving away the natives and their gods, like Tenochtitlan, before it was transformed into Mexico City and wiped out in 1521 by the conquistadores, or when the inhabitants of a given city lose the memory of themselves, and without realizing it, they become strangers to themselves. They become their own enemies. This was the case for Athens, which, after the glory of the classical polis and avenues of culture, art and history opened up by the likes of Sophocles, Euripides, Pericles, Socrates, Phidias, and so forth and so on, lost first its political independence and later ended up forgetting every memory of itself. We often tend to consider Athens as unchanged over many centuries and naively tend to believe that it flowered with renewed splendor when the Greece became independent in 1827. But it is not the case. Towards the end of the 12th century, when the erudite Michael Choniates arrived from Constantinople as the new bishop of Athens, he was shocked, as he tells us in a text which is preserved, he was shocked at the terrible ignorance of the Athenians. He says they no longer knew anything of the ancient glories of their own city. They cannot even identify to foreigners their temples, which are still intact. They were not able to indicate where Socrates or Plato or Aristotle had taught. The Parthenon was at the time a Christian church with walls covered in icons and where liturgical songs were heard and incense filled the air. It was later a Latin cathedral. It was plundered repeatedly by Italians, by Florentines and Venetians particularly, without the Athenians lifting a finger to defend the Parthenon or their monuments. When Athens was occupied by the Turks in 1456, 3 years after Constantinople, the Parthenon was transformed into a mosque, as you can see here, and even the name of the city was forgotten. What remained was a small village with odd ruin here and there, and the Athenians, reduced to a few thousand people, called it Satine, Satines, a mispronunciation of the name. So even Athens had lost even its name. But Athenians had begun to forget themselves long before this time. Already by around 430 AD, the Neoplatonic philosopher Proclus, who lived very close to the Acropolis, tells of having seen Athena, the goddess of the Parthenon, in a dream, who, having been driven from her seat, asked for hospitality in Proclus' house. This nostalgic dream clearly conveys the decline of a culture and its self-awareness. Now, today, we have forgotten that even Athens eventually forgot itself. But perhaps we should recall the darkness of that forgotten memory if we want to avoid suffering in our contemporary world the same affliction. And now let me come to Venice, a special city, greatly loved and very fragile. We all know the most monumental areas frequently visited by tourists, including ourselves, even if we have never explored its sestieri or minor churches, which are extraordinarily rich in urban and artistic merit. Let me mention very briefly some unique characteristics of Venice, such as an urban framework which has evolved over centuries, always maintaining only two means of getting about for people in Wales, by foot or by waterway. An extraordinary richness of monuments and works of art, which reflect the enormous prosperity of the Serenissima Repubblica. The constant decrease in the resident population, which I will come back to later. The continual increase of mass tourism, which invades the most famous areas of the city. And finally, the fashion of having a second home in Venice, which most of us would like to have, as many have, which has the effect of inflating prices and transforming Venice into a city of second homes, which often remain empty for almost the whole year. Venice is enclosed in its lagoon like a pearl in an oyster, but few understand the nature of the link between the lagoon and Venice. The city extends onto 118 islands linked by bridges, but to these should be added other islands, such as San Giorgio or Torcello, accessible only by water. City, islands, and lagoon make up an ecosystem unparalleled for the balance between natural environment and human presence. Lagoon has never been for Venice either a limit or a neutral space. It has been, and it should be, the very condition of its existence, and has transformed itself over time in harmony with the city, reflecting its beauty and its history with a sort of counter melody, a controcanto, I would say in Italian, without which even the voice of Venice would fade. This intimate union was represented in maps, for example in the plan by Benedetto Bordon 1528, in which the islands of the lagoon and the ring of land around the city, from Mestre to Lido, were conceived as a sort of periphery integrated into the urban dimension by means of accurate toponymic indicators. In this plan, we already see, for example, Marghera, which is highlighted on the corner on top left, a place I will mention later. Marghera is indicated by name, so it does belong to the urban space, although it is rather on the terraferma than in Venice itself. The territory of the Comune of Venice, Comune di Venezia, in current administrative divisions, includes a vast area of mainland, of which Marghera, Mestre, and other areas, as shown on the slide, including the Tessera airport, are part. And the population has moved towards these areas in recent decades, especially the younger generations, but mostly not because they like it better there, but because because it's much less expensive. They don't have enough money to live in the historical city. If we look at the population statistics for Venice, indeed, we see a noteworthy drop of 100,000 fewer inhabitants in the last few decades. But if we distinguish, as it's necessary, the mainland from the historical center, we see that the situation is much more dramatic. You have the statistics as reported in my book, in the English edition, which is updated in relation to the Italian edition, but I added for this lecture a last line with the statistics on June 30, and I've been told a few days ago that now a few less that now we are at 54,000, a few hundred. Now we know that 2.6 people on average move away from Venice every single day. If all the problems I will talk about are to be seen against this very worrying backdrop. Decrease of population in Venice historic center, in other words, doesn't necessarily mean increase in numbers of mainland Venice inhabitants, as shown by the chart here. You see the historic center is in blue and the terraferma is in red, but also the terraferma is declining. Now, if Venice has to die, it will not be on account of enemy invasions. It will be because most of Venetians and most of Italians have forgotten about Venice. And forgetting oneself for a community today does not only mean forgetting one's own history, it also means the lost understanding of the specific role of every city with respect to others, of the uniqueness and diversity of every city, virtues that perhaps no other city in the world possesses as much as Venice. Virtues that I think are necessary in a world in which the urban dimension has not only grown enormously, but has been distorted by the growth of gigantic megacities, human anthills, where, in the name of productivity, tens of millions of people gather, often condemned to conditions and patterns of life that have little to do with the original sense and spirit of the city. Let me mention as an example a place where I've never been, Chongqing in China, which in 1930 had 600,000 inhabitants and today has almost 34 million people living in it. 34 million people in the last few decades. The very notion of a city, a cultural creation which is a hotbed of thought and civilization, a laboratory for social relations and culture, tends to become the shell, often shapeless, of apparently spontaneous conurbations, actually controlled by small, wealthy minorities, while the majority of citizens are walled up in squalid housing blocks and are conceived of not as citizens but as workforce. This development is coming about with unequal speed in various parts of the world and allows us to perceive the difference between the old forma urbis and the growing idea of megalopolis. In Italy, this tension between the old city of citizens and the new farm of workers' ants, which are also and necessarily consumer ants, is expressed in the harsh contrast between historical centers and peripheries which besiege them. Having grown up in a haphazard and swift manner in the last few decades under the push of property speculation and land rents, Italian peripheries are in general characterized by an architecture of extremely poor aesthetic quality, by bad relation with their respective historical centers, by the poverty of spaces for social life. In hilltop cities like Siena, we still see its form from far away, but in other cities like, for instance, Naples, we see that they are characterized by an apparently unstoppable urban sprawl that actually translates in a relentless erosion of the very idea of a city, or more accurately, in its metastasis, in knots of indecipherable growth, entailing the destruction of every link with surrounding spaces. The centuries-old city-countryside harmony, which had made Italy the Garden of Europe, has died a violent death, and at the hands not of invaders, but of the Italians themselves. Cities are not only made of buildings and roads, but of men and women with their cultural, religious, and social connections. Urban form has been created and modified over time according to the powerful mechanism which Henri Lefebvre has termed the production of space, la production de l'espace. The space in which we live, being by its very nature a social space, is indeed the product of people and results from economic processes, from political decisions, from cultural choices which come together. Therefore, the space of an industrial civilization is radically different from that of an agricultural culture. For this reason, Venice, with its unique history and relation with the lagoon, has produced over the centuries, by and around itself, a cultural and social space of a density and originality with very few possible comparisons. Beyond the visible city of buildings and roads, there is an invisible city, a city, I would say, with a soul. It is defined by a double relationship of the city with the human body, i.e. the citizens who inhabit that city, and the relationship with nature, the surrounding countryside, in the case of Venice, the lagoon. And it entails a relationship of proportions between the body of the citizen and the body of the city. I would say that the body of the city mimics, repeats, enhances the citizen's body. It welcomes and guides the citizen. It echoes the voice and steps and leads him or her to streets and bridges, to canals and squares, with a rhythm and flow that in Venice, as much as elsewhere in historic cities, is a collective creation involving aristocrats and merchants, artisans and sailors, glass workers and gunsmiths, men and women. In its long history, Venice conquered the right to the city for those who dwell in it, which in this city also means a right to nature, a right to the well-being of the lagoon, which has been integral to Venetian life and history for millennia. Today, though, hundreds of millions of people live in gigantic built-up areas crowded by tens of millions of people, areas built to increase the production of goods for all and to increase the profits for a few people, without limit. And this process of concentrating people into giant beehives seems destined to expand in the future. It's difficult, at least for me, to believe that those who live in such cities live better lives than those who live in historic cities, reflecting an articulate urban culture such as Venice. Yet, megacities have become an ineluctable icon of our time and are tendentially identified with the very idea of modernity. Yet do we really want to think that the megalopolis will supplant all other urban forms forever? Or would it instead be worthwhile to keep other alternatives in mind when we think of the city of the future? Do we wish, that's the question, to nurture or to destroy the multiplicity and diversity of urban forms? Venice and Chongqing are two quite different models of communal living. Thus, in order to better understand Chongqing, we must inevitably think also of Venice. Like megalopolis, the skyscraper is taken as an icon of modernity, especially where skyscrapers are not so common, such as in Italy. And it is perhaps for this reason that, as part of a project presented at the Venice Biennale in 2010, a plan was proposed by a Belgian architect with Italian assistants to save Venice from the high waters by surrounding it by, quote, a corolla of skyscrapers built on artificial reefs, which surrounds the city, protects it from the seas, and repopulates it with Venetians. Let me read from the site of this Belgian study the accompanying text. When looking at a not-so-distant future, they say, we have a few certainties. Sea level will rise and global warming will affect climate. Aqualta 2060, that's the name of the project, is an attempt to describe this scenario. How do we protect the city from the sea? What if we consider building a new edge, a linear city emerging from the water around Venice, a new frame and a new perspective toward Venice to preserve and enjoy the historical city? What does this city look like? It is a long waterfront stretching in front of Venice, and if the weather is warmer, why not think of it as the Italian Copacabana? I'm quoting. A long beach submerged by tropical vegetation. What a nice view, what a nice perspective. A vision of a vision, they continue, the old Venice overlooking the bay of Ipanema. The new town, beaches and houses will have the glorious backdrop of an unseen Venice. So far the quote. Let's highlight 2 points of this text. On the one hand, Venice is being cast on 2 other latitudes, like it might be a sort of periphery of Rio de Janeiro. On the other, it is no longer a city in which to live, but rather a city to observe from afar. In order to enjoy the view of the historical city, indeed, it is good to think of it as a glorious backdrop for whoever will live in the skyscrapers, which is the real place, the place for real human beings. In a vision such as this, the Venetians who would stay in the historical city would be like fish in an aquarium. A corolla of skyscrapers was also in the mind of a former mayor of Rome, who in 2010, same year as the Venice Biennale, said officially he wanted to make Rome's periphery denser by constructing a corolla of skyscrapers meant to rise above the Dome of St. Peter's, which so far is considered the height limit for buildings in Rome. We would then, he said, have a Rome of skyscrapers next to the most important city center in the world. That's in the word of a former mayor of Rome. Skyscrapers in Rome, skyscrapers in Venice, skyscrapers really built in Milan, as you see here in the, on the screen. The party line goes as follows. In Italy, in the last few decades, there have been too few high-quality architectural projects. Now it is therefore the moment to make up for lost time. This fever to update is a provincial obsession that makes the skyscraper the symbol and incarnation of modernity, forgetting that actually the skyscrapers were the real incarnation of modernity in New York or Chicago 100 years ago. Not now. Therefore, even a great architect such as Renzo Piano is now building a skyscraper in Turin, which according to the original project should be, as in this picture, taller than the Mole Antonelliana, and thereby breaking city regulations. After many protests, the height was reduced by 1 foot. A ridiculous difference which is not a sign of respect, but instead as near. However, building skyscraper today in Italy means updating Italian cities to a century ago, or better, not imitating New York or Chicago, but Chongqing, Singapore, or Dubai. I hope you will forgive me if I continue to prefer the Venice by Odoardo Fialetti, a rather glorious version of the city even without skyscrapers. Now, before speaking of more disturbing situations, I would briefly like to mention, very briefly, the rules for safeguarding artistic heritage currently in place in Italy. Norms of all the Italian states, those that existed before the unification of Italy in mid-19th century, norms of all the Italian states, including the Republic of Venice, are the oldest in the world. And they acquired new strength and impetus from the notion of patrimoine national, or cultural heritage, created during the French Revolution and imported into Italy. Current laws are historically based on legislation from the 20th century. And let me only mention that legislation on landscape, the first Italian law on landscape is dated 1920, and the Minister for Education at that point was the greatest Italian philosopher of that time, Benedetto Croce, when a great philosopher like Benedetto Croce could be a minister. A very important turning point was the Constitution of the Italian Republic in 1947, where Article 9 reads, "The Republic, the Italian Republic, safeguards natural landscape and the historical and artistic heritage of the nation." For the first time, in 1947, the principle of heritage entered into the founding principles of the constitution of a modern state, although they are precedents in the constitution, particularly of the Weimar Republic in Germany. Notwithstanding the constitution and the laws, in Venice as elsewhere, the erosion of the very idea of a city takes place also in Italy, above all in the destruction of the centuries-old harmony between city and countryside. What elsewhere is countryside, for Venice is the lagoon, where the waters of the sea mix with those of the rivers. Lagoon and city, taken together, form a complex ecosystem that was preserved and implemented in time through mechanisms of surveillance and management over the waters. The Magistrato delle Acque, created in about 1510, has been unfortunately abolished 2 years ago by the Italian government. Now, today, Venice appears to many as a city like any other, whose development is only limited by the lagoon. The lagoon is seen as an empty space, as a limit to the city. It has therefore been proposed to save Venice from isolation, while at the beginning of the 20th century, the futurists thought to fill in and tarmac over the Grand Canal. Their heirs today foresee a Venice, Padua, Treviso underground system in order to create a single megacity out of the three with underground lines which would run under the lagoon. In short, as it stands, Venice increasingly looks as dramatically outdated. There are vast territorial restructuring projects whereby the city would change its name in English: Veneto City or Venice Land. Huge built-up areas. I'm just quoting, and they are serious about it. I'm joking, but they are not. Huge built-up areas where one imagines that real life, that of production and consumption of goods, is carried out in areas of new construction, while historical Venice could be an exciting sort of periphery on seashore, a theme park. Such a Venice would be actually a sort of Disneyland, more like to the creations of Las Vegas than the city of the Doge's Palace and of St. Mark's Basilica. This process of Disneyification had been pre-announced many years ago. I found an article in 1981 by one of the leading professors of architecture in the Politecnico di Milano, published in 1981 in the journal Urbanistica, whereby he said that, quote, "The transformation of Venice into a Disneyland could signal the passage to a more creative, more cheerful, and more festive way of living." Actually, no city in the world like Venice goes against a model of urban development based on urban densification and architectural verticalization. Protected by the lagoon in a millennial-old symbiotic relationship, this city appears a happy island in a world afflicted by uncontrollable metamorphosis. According to architectural historian Manfredo Tafuri, quote, "Venice is an unbearable challenge to the world of modernity that elicits assaults by developers, ambitions by architects and massive invasions of tourists. Indeed, all you need is to stop for a few hours in Venice to be threatened, gun to your head, by the ghosts of a modernity that takes the form of mega ships, almost ephemeral skyscrapers within the city itself. As temples of consumerism, I will show a few slides taken from real life in Venice. As temples of consumerism, the cruise ships which invade the city, destroying its skyline, better resemble huge Las Vegas hotels than ships. Like in Las Vegas, ships with thousands of beds, 4,000 beds for instance, pass themselves off as exclusive luxury, but are holiday machines that sell illusions, passing the most banal mass tourism off as highly personalized. Ships that are ephemeral sanctuaries of health rituals and try their best to look like a condensed city. But their moment of glory for these monster ships is when they can show off their pompous arrogance of being an artificial city, forcing their way into the docks of San Marco, challenging the millennia-old basilica and the Palazzo Ducale with their garish bulk. The mega ships penetrate the heart of Venice to see its beauty, but they overshadow and damage the city, changing its perception. To mention but one, the ship called Divina is 220 feet high, twice as tall as the Doge's Palace, and 1,094 feet wide, twice the breadth of Piazza San Marco. At times, up to a dozen liners have entered the lagoon in a single day. Megaships are only, so you can be in Venice and see things like this. Megaships are only the most visible sign of a tourism that devastates Venice's social and cultural fabric. 8 million tourists pour into Venice's streets and canals each year, to the point that tourists outnumber Venetians 140 to 1. Such a disproportion has the impact of a bomb and is profoundly altering the population and the economy, as native citizens are banished from the island city, and those who remain are shackled to serve in hotels, restaurants, and shops selling glass souvenirs and carnival masks. Alarm at this state of affairs led to recent UNESCO decisions to place Venice on its World Heritage in Danger list unless substantial progress to halt the degradation of the city is made by February 2017. In Italy, these ships had the terrible habit of passing dangerously close to the coast. After the shipwreck of the Costa Concordia in January 2012 left 32 people dead off the coast of Tuscany, the Italian government ruled that mega ships must stay at least 2 miles away from shore to prevent similar occurrences in the future. And this has been enforced with one exception, Venice, where there is no limit. I think that this is very telling as the inability to deal with the problems of Venice. Besides the horrible visual impact of mega ships, one can also add a significant decrease in water quality, a higher risk of collision and of the subsequent spilling of hydrocarbons in the heart of the city, a risk that increases with the number of cruise liners that are allowed. Authorities try to deny the effect of this pressure, and there is no clear data, no official data on the pollution of dust particles. Apparently 500 tons of dust particles dumped by ships in Venice in every single year. There are very vague data on the presence of benzopyrene, highly toxic, a highly toxic chemical being versed in the lagoon. The forma urbis of Venice irreparably contradicts the model of modernity that takes the skyscraper of this symbol. On the other hand, though, a very concrete project for a skyscraper in Venice, and particularly in Marghera, has been seriously launched by Pierre Cardin, a French fashion designer who is actually Pietro Cardin, born in Treviso. His Palais Lumière would cost €1.5 billion, rising 820 feet high and covering an area of 43 acres in Marghera's dilapidated industrial zone, 3 interlacing towers, 60 habitable floors, a university of fashion, and then offices, shops, hotels, conference spaces, restaurants, megastores, and sport grounds. A vertical city presented as a unique occasion to reclaim an industrial area in decline, but also a dramatic transformation of Venice's skyline, high more than twice the Campanile di San Marco, that would be built in defiance to all the urban norms. Impossible not to see it from the Piazza San Marco, especially by night, because if it is to be a Palais Lumière, it has to be very visible by night. Not only this, it would also cut across flight paths, violating the height restriction imposed by the National Civil Aviation Body by violation of those rules by 360 feet. So if this is ever built, please don't fly to Venice. But fortunately, the project has been abandoned recently. And given the very negative public opinion in Italy and elsewhere. But Pierre Cardin came so far as to advertise apartments in his Palais Lumière in shop windows in France. And the dark stain you see here, you see, what is this? This is Venice, seen from afar. Venice as a backdrop that it uses to increase the price of the different apartments, especially on the highest floors. So now the question is, why? What do the Palais Lumière and the cruise liners down the Grand Canal have in common? There are, some say, good opportunities for Venice, but I ask, why, if we want to take tourists to Venice by sea, it is done with high-polluting cruise liners? Why, over the enormous area he would have at his disposal, does Cardin or Cardin not construct 2, 3, or 5 smaller towers with the same total surface area? Because he wants it to be visible from afar. There's only one possible answer. In all these cases, violating Venice is not an unwanted consequence. It is rather at the heart of the project. It is, as someone said, essential to execrate this glorious city, which irritates the priests of modernity, that's Tafuri, general commenting on the process. A glorious city which irritates the priests of modernity much as an unwilling virgin might irritate a womanizer who thinks himself irresistible, a Don Giovanni who thinks himself irresistible. The desecration, or rather the visibility of the desecration, bears a strong symbolic meaning. It is a statement of hyper-modernity. Now, my little book that has been recently published also in English, thanks to Michael Weiss, is centered on Venice, as its title implies. Nevertheless, in my intention, it strives for a wider scope, namely the destiny of historic sites, of historic cities, as contrasted with a few dominant behavioral and architectural models, such as the skyscraper or the megalopolis. I'm obviously aware that Venice is subject, perhaps more than any other city, to the potentially dramatic consequences of climate change and rising sea level. This point is relatively marginal in my book and in this lecture. It is definitely not because I think it is not important, but because it belongs to a global horizon or scenario whereby Venice's destiny is similar to that of other cities worldwide, including New York City. In addition to this point, that is obviously critically important, I am proposing Venice as a privileged vantage point that might inspire thoughts or considerations on an equally important issue, namely the evolution, shape, and destiny of the urban form. Ideas and socio-cultural practices about the city of the future seem to be determined today by 3 interrelated factors. I already mentioned the unstoppable growth of megacities first, and the verticalization of architecture, the rhetoric of skyscrapers second, both exemplified in this slide. Let me add, lastly, the dissipation boundaries separating city and countryside. You see here in the wonderful fresco in Siena, you all are familiar with, this boundary very clearly defined. So let me go back between the city and the countryside that are complementary to one another. We may say, on the contrary, that what's going on is that while the boundaries of the city, separating it from a countryside intimately connected with the city itself, like in Siena, are destroyed. And a new type of boundaries is increasingly rising, the boundaries within the city, as in this example from Brazil, in which the boundary is between a gated community with tennis courts and little pools on the balconies and a favela here. Boundaries within the cities, between gentrified and abandoned neighborhoods and gated communities for the elites, while the suburbs are teeming with all the new poor, as seen in this impressive example. What is, or rather was, the countryside in Siena or Florence or the Campagna in Rome is still very much visible in Venice as the lagoon, more than in any other place. This is one among many reasons why what happens in Venice does not only concern Venice, but us all. Venice, indeed, because it is precious, it is unique, it is improbable. It is the most improbable city in the world. Still, it is still there. In its very singular connection with the waters and the mainland, is going against the grain because it is naturally pedestrianized and without cars, and is the dominant symbol on a planetary scale of the human measure of the historic city. Now, the question is, should we preserve this experience of space or dilute it, assuming that a new model, that of megacities, skyscrapers, boundaries within the city, socioeconomic boundaries within the city, will it be the only possible form for the city of the future? Or do we have space for the diversity in the shape of cities? Let's take Venice as a potential laboratory and litmus test wherefrom to look at the global decline of historical centers, often marginalized and thought of as being left over in relation to the real place where new buildings, possibly vertical, are being built. Assaults to Venice's urban shape have an acknowledged but obvious goal: to erase diversity, to homogenize cities, to substitute civil conversation among citizens for created spaces, for cities as machines for production and consumption of goods. So let us pause for a moment to think, inspired by, I hope, by this thoughtful Athena. As a great icon of the historic city, Venice is precisely for this reason the most important target for whoever aims at denying the very raison d'etre of urban diversity, as the most convenient scenario where to experiment different kinds of social and cultural life. But if we want to save Venice from the offenses which can bring it to death, it is not enough to be indignant and to protest. The decisive move is to elaborate a project for the future of this city, which preserves its uniqueness, based on what I would call a two-faced far-sightedness, i.e., I mean the ability to look simultaneously backwards to the historical legacy and forward the future of Venice, not as a museum, not as a theme park, not as a place for tourists, but as a city for human beings, for its own citizens primarily. Then the tourists can come, of course, but for citizens primarily. We cannot reduce Venice to a place for tourists where all the citizens must be servants to tourism and not cultivate any other productive or creative human activity. Our generation, not just in Venice but everywhere, has been tasked with a great responsibility to show that diversity and beauty are not weighty legacies from the past, but an extraordinary gift to live with in the present, an extraordinary endowment to build upon for guaranteeing the future. In the world in which we live, we should show that there is space for diversity of urban models, for diversity of cultures, of lifestyles, that the urban space has developed in Venice, as well as in other historic cities, does have a right of citizenship in the world of today and of tomorrow. Because if Venice dies, that's the reason for the title of my book, it will not only be Venice that falls, the very idea of the city will die. That form of the city as an open, varied space for social life as the very foundation of civilization, and let me say also of democracy. Thank you very much indeed.
Okay, so I see the time is 3:55, so we did start late by about 10 minutes, so let's keep rolling a little further. We don't have a lot of time for questions, but let's try maybe 3, all right? Are there questions?
There's a question over there.
Speak loudly.
Yes. I was just simply going to ask what you would suggest those of us who don't have the knowledge of Venice that you do, that love the city, can do to help save it.
Well, I think that awareness by public opinion in important countries, particularly here in this country, particularly in this city, awareness of what's going on is extremely important in order to influence the government bodies that have to take decisions about it. And decisions are sometimes not that difficult. For instance, if we think about the problems of second homes in Venice, it has been calculated that on average, people who possess a second home in Venice, often very wealthy people who buy a palazzo on Grand Canal, but they stay in Venice on average 2.5 days a year. Now, they are not citizens. They cannot participate in the life of the city. Now, it is possible to reduce the number of second homes in Venice. Is it possible? Yes, it is. Because in Switzerland, they passed the law 2 or 3 years ago by which in each city of the Switzerland, even in the smallest villages, you can have more than 20% of second homes. This is Switzerland. This is not a communist country. So if this is possible in Switzerland, why not in Italy? Why nobody thinks about doing it? Why nobody even proposes to do it? So I think that awareness of public opinion and pressure from public opinion in all over the world, and particularly in this country, would be extremely important. It would be extremely important to put pressure on the governmental bodies who are very keen to hear the petty business of developers or tourist organization or tourism or organization, and less inclined to understand what the big problems are.
I think there's some questions that came earlier. There was a woman in the back who had her hand up.
It seems obvious that the cruise ships need to be stopped, but obviously there must be some desire to have the tourists come and spend the money. So, who could stop the cruise ships?
Well, first of all, apparently only 10% of the people who come to Venice on those cruise ships finds the time of going into Venice and spend something. So for most of them, looking at Venice from the highest part of the ship is more than enough. Looking down at the Doge's Palace in Bazzo, that must be a very interesting experience. Which, but I really never did it, so I can tell. But for some reason, it is considered. And there are several projects on where to bring. One possibility is to bring people in a neighboring place like Trieste, which is a great port which is in big crisis, and then with smaller, or to have them arrive somewhere. There are several projects, but the first thing to do is to make clear that cruise ships cannot enter the docks of San Marco. Bacino di San Marco cannot be entered by those gigantic cruise ships. This should be absolutely necessary. Now, the Autorità Portuale, as it is called in Venice, they have another project. They want to excavate a canal within the lagoon for the cruise ships, bringing them somewhere else. But excavating a similar canal was the cause of the big flood that happened at the same year of the flood in Florence, just in '66, I think. So now, do we want something like this to happen? So there is a great reactions against this, and I hope that eventually they will decide to do it differently. But
You choose.
yeah, okay. Let's start.
Okay.
I think this
Do
came
you have-
earlier.
Do you have any thoughts on what industries might supplement tourism in Venice?
Well,
There are obviously some industries have to
well,
expand
the
tourism.
in the area of Marghera, there was a big chemical industry that contributed significantly, polluting the lagoon and creating other. But to create jobs in Venice and to create jobs that would contrast the increasing unemployment of young people, which in Italy, as you probably know, is 38%. By contrast with 22% on average in the states of European Union. So this is a big a problem that goes much beyond Venice. But in Venice, it is possible to imagine different activities, and particularly creative activities. Something that works very well in Venice is the Biennale. Some that works very well are the universities in Venice, but many young people who would like to live in Venice while going to the university, they are unable to do so because it's too expensive. So it's not very easy to have in a few words a general plan about Venice, but it is very easy to say that if there are no attempts at such a plan, the city is condemned forever, which is something I would not like to happen.
We'll take two more questions.
One is there.
I was wondering if you're aware of the irony is, I know you say you don't like cruise ships, but obviously one of the major industries there in Marghera is the construction of cruise ships. So I was wondering, you know, right outside, you know, it's one of the major industries there.
Well, but I think I think that those cruise ships are not built there. I think that the presence of cruise ships that must be judged and decided upon based on whether they pollute the lagoon, whether they make the life of citizens worse, whether they make the protection of cultural heritage more difficult, and this is something that is already very clear. So I understand that problems cannot be solved from today in one night, but I think that starting doing something in that direction would be very good. What happens instead is that whenever one of the many problems of Venice is addressed, such as by the so-called MOSE, the sort of barrier to be created against high water, acqua alta. You may know there was it's a very long story in the last 30 years or so, with a story of corruption, a terrible amount of money that has been lost and thrown away. It has been calculated by a book by a very good economist who also teaches at Harvard, who is Italian, Francesco Giavazzi, that at least 2 billion euros were spent in corruption. So if we spend in corruption 2 billion euros, why we shouldn't try to spend something in helping people living in Venice rather than moving away from it. So that's the complexity of the problem, which I have tried more in the book than in the lecture, of course, to give an idea of is something to think about. One more question?
Thank you. Just a quick question. What's amazing about Venice is that it's actually still standing. So I think my question is, what is the city doing or the government of Italy doing to preserve the foundation of Venice?
Very little. this moment, very, very little. And unfortunately, what is the fact that that little is doing for preservation of the lagoon, in time will endanger the entire city. So I think we are still in time. And making, as I've said, public opinion alert in this respect would be very, very important. So I hope that you all in this room will be among those who are aware of the problems of Venice and contribute this and contribute making this awareness wider and more and deeper.
I'm going to take just one really last question and there.
Hi. I have a question about new technologies. Since you put an image of Venice, I'm going to ask this. I think in Italy a big part of the problem is that there's a high concentration of tourism in very 3 or 4 places, and everyone goes to the same place, take a picture,
yep.
and goes. Places that perhaps are not even meant to be visited. And so my question is about new technologies, and now that there's the possibility to sort of reconstruct a lot of these places, and I think there's a company called Factum Arte that is working in that.
Yes, I know them. I visited them in Madrid several times.
So my question is, like, what do you think of that as a solution to solve the problem of tourism? Is it in Vegas, or is it?
Well, I think that building a new Venice and convincing people to go to the fake Venice instead of the real one, I think this is something that goes beyond my imagination. I like people from Factum Arte. I visited their laboratory, and I also made the official speech when the big Veronese painting, whose original is in the Louvre, was inaugurated in the island of San Giorgio Maggiore, and which is a wonderful copy, but it is very clearly a copy. So the copy in that particular case is very important because you have the Veronese. The Veronese is at the Louvre and will never come back to Italy. But seeing the Veronese painting in a very well done copy in the space by Andrea Palladio, made for that particular painting. This changes totally the perception. In this case, it is very good. But the idea of doing the very same thing somewhere you can do it in Arizona if you wish, but this would not be Venice.
All right, we'll have to stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.